Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to study analogy, and this is in lesson number 6. Before we continue, let us have our most essential learning competency. Use analogy to describe and to make a point. Now, considering our learning competencies, you have to identify figures of speech that show comparison, which could be found in simile, metaphor, and personification. Another thing is that you have to identify figures of speech that show contrast, and this could be oxymoron, paradox, and irony. Number 3, discriminate between literal and figurative language. And number 4, classify sample text into literal or figurative. And to keep it simpler, you have to define simile, metaphor, and analogy. Hopefully, we could define oxymoron, paradox, and irony as well. Now, let us go now to the learning tasks to see if you have a prior knowledge with regards to the lesson that we are about to discuss today. Here is our instructions. Read, examine, and classify each sentence below as to simile, metaphor, or analogy. Write your answers in your notebook. This time, class, I will just ask you to give me a wise guess with regards to this item. Why? Because you don't have any knowledge of the following things that we are about to discuss. Maybe in your previous class, you have your, or in your previous grade, you have your simile and metaphor, but not the analogy. So, for now, you just have to give me a wise guess. I'll give you 1 minute to give me your answer. Don't forget to write your answer in your notebook. So, let's begin. Your 1 minute starts now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time is up. Now for task number 2, this is your instructions. Identify which of the statements below are true about analogy. In your notebook, write go if the statement is correct and no if it is otherwise or if it says otherwise. Okay, your 1 minute starts now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time is up. Okay, let us now go to the development part of the lesson. Let us have the definition of the word analogy. In this definition, it says here that an analogy is a literary technique that involves comparison of how two things are alike. but with the ultimate goal of making a point about this comparison. So if I'm going to use my own words to explain analogy, this is a literary technique which you have to see the two things that are alike and you are going to compare it. But it's not going to end in that because you have to see the explanation why they are being compared. Okay, so to give us more detail of that, let us have the example that I have here in my slide. Let's take a look at simile, metaphor, and the example of analogy. Here, I just use one statement and I am comparing life and tree. Same thing when I use that statement in a metaphoric way. Life, tree. In analogy, I also compare life to a tree. But let's take a look at how simile is formed, how metaphor is formed, and how analogy is formed. Let's have the example. Example of simile. Life is like a tree. Again, life is like a tree. In metaphor, it states like this. Life is a tree. So what do you think is the difference between simile and metaphor? I'll give you a chance to think. Very good. In simile, there are two things that is being compared, like life and tree. But there is the word like. Correct. Now, aside from like, you could also use the word as. Okay. Another idea. What about for metaphor? What is being compared here? You are comparing life to a tree, but there is no use of the word like or as. So this is now what we call a direct comparison. Okay, so that is what we call a direct comparison. Okay, I think that would help us see it much better. Now, what about in analogy? In analogy, I used again, life is just like a tree. So, is this simile or metaphor? Very good. This statement is simile. But can I use metaphor here? You're correct. I can also use metaphor if I'm going to take away like, it is now a metaphor, right? But take a look at the next statement. The next statement goes like this. It starts from a seedling that grows into a full-grown tree that has strength and branches that make itself strong and bear wonderful fruits. So, what do you notice about analogy? A while ago, you were able to differentiate simile to metaphor. But take a look at simile, metaphor, and analogy. What is the big difference between the three? That's right. In analogy, there is another statement that explains or make a point with regards to the metaphor or simile that they had used or that I have used in this statement. So, the explanation that life is just like a tree is this. It's true that life begins in a seedling when we are all eggs in the tummy of our mother, and then later on when we came out, we grew into a full grown tree and we became strong. That's when we are like a tree with a trunk. Okay, the part of the tree that is the strongest is the trunk. So when we became older, when we aged, when we are experiencing a lot of experiences and situations in life, we became stronger. And that is the symbol of the trunk. Now, what about the branches? Maybe these branches are the many people around us, or even the family and the friends, or even the situations and the experiences that we are having as we grow. And that makes us strong and bear wonderful fruits. So that is the explanation. And it is being divided by a symbol. And that symbol is dash. Okay? So take a look. Simile, there is the use of like to compare two things. Metaphor, there is no use of like or as because it is a direct comparison. And when we say analogy, we could use simile or metaphor, but there is an explanation so that you could make a point. Okay? So that is what we called analogy. Now, another thing that you have to know about analogy is that there are two types of analogy. One is an analogies that identify identical relationship. What is this? This is the type of analogy takes the form A is to B as C is to D, and is often used to directly illustrate similar relationships between two pairs of words, often for the purpose of logical argument. So I have here an example. So you're not going to read it like this: English colon language colon mathematics colon arithmetic. Instead, you are going to read it this way: A is to B, like English is to language, English is to language as. So the two colon here is as mathematics is to arithmetic. Now, you have to figure out what is the relationship between English and language, mathematics, and arithmetic. What do you think is their relationship? Very good. Language. English is an example of a language. So mathematics is also an example of arithmetic. So that is now the relationship between the two informations or the two words. Okay? Now let's have an example here. Great white shark is to giant anchovies as anchovies into small. So what do you think is the relationship between the two? Great white shark is to giant as anchovies is small. Very good. So this is an example of a giant animal found in the ocean, and anchovies are small animals or small fish found in the ocean. So we are talking about of the weight or the size of these animals found in the ocean.